I thought he was just a rebel, a little bold, a little dangerous, and that's what made him so irresistible. I didn't drink, didn't smoke, never skipped a lecture, but one day he asked me to get in the car, just for a minute, told me, just sit and watch if anyone's coming. An hour later, I heard gunshots. A week later, I heard the verdict: life in prison, for love, for naivety, for one single yes. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Claire Bennington. I was 21 years old when everything in my life split into two halves, before and after. Before, I was what people like to call a good girl. I came from a modest, quiet family in Ann Arbor, Michigan. My father was a high school history teacher, the kind who loved dry facts and tidy conclusions. My mother worked as a librarian at the community college. They packed my lunches until I graduated high school and sent handwritten notes in the mail during my first year of college. I still have one of those notes, the ink slightly smudged by my mother's shaky hand, telling me how proud they were. At the University of Michigan, I studied biochemistry, not because it was fashionable or easy, but because I wanted to matter in some way. I didn't dream of fame or wealth. I wanted a small lab, a quiet office, a white coat, and something useful to do with my life. I wanted to help people. That sounds naive now. Maybe it always was. But at the time, I believed it with the clarity only someone young and untouched by real pain can believe anything. I wasn't the kind of girl people noticed. My hair was always tied back, my jeans slightly too long, and my shoes scuffed from miles of walking between campus buildings. I kept to myself. I wasn't shy, just careful. I had seen too many classmates lose their footing, swept up in parties, noise, or love that burned too fast. I studied in the quietest corners of the library. I highlighted my textbooks with precision. I called my parents every Sunday. I never skipped a lecture. There was a certain pride in that, in being reliable, in being trusted. Professors liked me. My classmates asked to borrow my notes. I was the girl who tutored chemistry without charging money, who reminded others about homework deadlines, who volunteered at the Science Center on weekends because it felt like the right thing to do. Sometimes I wondered what it would feel like to break a rule. Just one. Not a big one. Something small. Skip a class. Get a tattoo. Kiss someone I shouldn't. But those thoughts passed quickly, and I always returned to the safety of my order, to the comfort of a schedule typed out and taped neatly above my desk. My world was made of lab reports, coffee in paper cups, highlighters in pastel colors, and lists of scholarship applications. My dorm was clean and quiet, my roommates equally studious. On Friday nights, I stayed in, curled up with books or documentaries or soft music humming through my headphones, while other students spilled into streets with red plastic cups and blurry laughter. I boiled water for tea. I knew what people said about me, that I was too serious, too focused, too safe. It never bothered me. I wore it like armor until the night I met him. It was late September. The trees had just begun to turn, their edges tinged with amber and gold. I had gone to the library after my biology lab ran over, hoping to finish a paper before midnight. The building was nearly empty, just a few students spread across the tables, heads down. The quiet felt sacred, broken only by the occasional shuffle of pages or the faint hum of a printer. I sat at my usual spot, tucked behind a row of encyclopedias no one touched anymore. That's when I heard the laugh, loud, unfiltered, and completely out of place. I looked up instinctively. He was standing near the front desk, talking to one of the student workers like he owned the room. He wasn't part of my world. I could tell from the way he moved, too casual, too confident. He wore a leather jacket, dark jeans, and scuffed boots that marked the floor as he walked. He didn't carry a backpack. He wasn't holding a book. And yet he looked like he belonged. I remember staring too long. He noticed. He smiled at me across the distance like we shared some secret, like I was in on the joke I didn't understand. It was the first time in years I felt off balance, like the ground beneath me wasn't as solid as I believed. Later that night, I sat on my bed, my book still open, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept circling back to him. Who was he? What was he doing in the library if he wasn't a student? Why did he look at me like he knew me? Why did I care? I told myself it was just a moment, a strange interruption in my otherwise predictable life. Nothing more. But something inside me had shifted. I had spent years building a world of safety, of logic, of routines that kept me steady. But that laugh, sharp and unafraid, had cracked something. And once something cracks, even slightly, it doesn't take much to let the chaos in. I didn't know then how fast everything would unravel, how one look could lead to a conversation, and a conversation to a ride, and a ride to a choice I would never be able to take back. But in that moment, sitting in the dim light of my dorm room, with textbooks open and a mug of tea gone cold beside me, I only knew one thing. For the first time in my life, I wanted to break the rules, just once, and I had no idea how much that one break would cost. He started calling me Professor the second time we spoke. It was a nickname that made no sense, and all the sense in the world, depending on how you looked at it. He said it with a crooked smile, his head tilted just slightly to the side, like he was daring me to correct him. I never did. At first, I thought it was a joke, his way of teasing a girl he found amusing. But later, I came to understand it for what it was, a hook, and I was already caught on the line. His name was Jordan, though for weeks I only heard others say it. He never introduced himself formally. He just appeared, like a ripple in the surface of my life, disrupting the calm I had spent years trying to build. He wasn't enrolled in any classes, and he didn't work at the library or on campus. He had a way of slipping in and out of places like he didn't need permission, like rules were suggestions that didn't apply to him. I ran into him again near the campus cafe. I was waiting for a drip coffee buried in the pages of an immunology textbook when I heard someone say, "Careful, Professor, reading that much'll ruin your eyesight." I looked up and there he was, leaning on the edge of the counter, like he had all the time in the world. He was the opposite of everything I had ever let into my world. He didn't carry books. He didn't check his email on his phone. He didn't seem to worry about anything. His hair was always a little too long, curling behind his ears, and his eyes had that restless shine I'd only seen in stray dogs and people who'd been outside the system too long. He made eye contact without flinching, and when he looked at me, it felt like he was seeing something I didn't even know I had. I told myself not to get pulled in. I told myself it was nothing. But it never is it? The nickname stuck. Every time we crossed paths, at the library steps, at the edge of the quad, near the vending machines in the science building, he'd greet me the same way. "Hey, Professor." It made me feel visible, like someone had stepped into my carefully muted world and turned on a light. He never asked what I was studying. He just assumed it was something smart, something serious. That's what the name meant. It was both admiration and mockery. I pretended not to like it, but deep down, it felt like a prize I hadn't known I was competing for. We started talking. Small conversations at first, always in passing, then longer ones. I didn't know where he lived, or what he did for money, or why he spent so much time on campus when he clearly didn't belong to it. But I learned that he read poetry and had a talent for fixing motorcycles, that he had an older sister who used to beat him at chess, and a mother who disappeared when he was 15. I learned that he hated being called unreliable and that he'd been arrested once, but only for something stupid. He always said stupid like it didn't matter, like it wasn't a real crime. He made me laugh, not because he was funny in a rehearsed way, but because he saw the absurdity in things I had never questioned. He joked about the students rushing to lectures, the professors who took themselves too seriously, the way I highlighted every page of my notes like I was afraid of missing something life-changing. He said I looked like someone who'd never broken a rule in her life. He said it like it was both a compliment and a challenge. I didn't know how to explain the thrill of those moments, how the world seemed to bend around his voice, how the air felt thicker when he stood close. It wasn't about love, not yet. It was about being seen, being noticed, being pulled from the background and given a role in someone else's story. He invited me to things, not dates exactly. A couple of people are getting together, he'd say. You should come. Sometimes it was a bonfire in the woods just past the county line. Sometimes it was a late-night diner with music playing from someone's car in the parking lot. Sometimes it was just sitting in his beat-up Dodge, watching the streetlights flicker like they were short-circuiting time. At first, I said no. I had papers to write, labs to finish, deadlines. But eventually, I began saying yes, one night at a time. My world shifted, not all at once, but slowly. I still went to classes, still took notes, still showed up for lab. But there were moments, hours, days, where I drifted outside the edges of that life, where I let go of the girl who always followed the rules, where I let myself feel something besides control. He called me professor, but I stopped feeling like one. In his world, I was something else. Someone braver, more interesting, someone with sharp eyes and steady hands, someone who could hold her own in a conversation that had nothing to do with science or research. I liked that version of myself. I liked the heat of it. There were things I didn't ask, things I chose not to know, like where he went when he wasn't with me, like what he meant when he said he had a job to do, like why his phone never rang in front of me, like why some of his friends didn't use their real names. I told myself those things didn't matter, that I was separate from them, that I was just visiting his world, not living in it. But I was wrong. The truth was, by the time he leaned across the hood of his car and grinned at me like I was his lucky charm, I was already too deep to see the surface. By the time he reached for my hand and said, "You're not like the others, Claire," I had already stopped being the girl I used to be. And when he looked me in the eyes and said, "I need a favor, just something small," I didn't hesitate, because by then, I would have done anything to keep him looking at me that way. It was a Sunday afternoon in late October, the kind where the sky looks too pale and the trees have already let go of most of their leaves. The wind was dry, restless, and the streets were nearly empty, like everyone was somewhere better, warmer, safer. Jordan had texted me in the morning. Just 3 words. "Want to get out?" No explanation, no details. I said yes before I even thought to ask where we were going. He picked me up in the old Dodge. The engine sounded rougher than usual, growling when he hit the gas. He had one hand on the wheel and one arm resting across the back of my seat, like he was already relaxed. There were two people in the back, a guy I'd seen around a few times, tall, silent, with a faded hoodie pulled low over his face, and a girl named Lacey, who chewed gum like it was a threat. She nodded at me, but didn't smile. Jordan didn't tell me where we were headed. I didn't ask. I remember thinking maybe we were going to the lake like we had before, just to sit on the hood of the car and talk until the cold chased us back inside. The music was too loud for conversation, some bass-heavy track that made the windows vibrate slightly. I stared out at the blur of strip malls, gas stations, and gray skies, feeling the kind of nervous excitement that made your stomach flip for no good reason. Eventually, we pulled into a parking lot I didn't recognize. It was a corner gas station. Half the lights on the sign burned out, the kind of place you pass 100 times without ever going inside. Jordan parked near the side entrance. The others got out without a word. Lacey lit a cigarette, and the guy adjusted his hoodie tighter around his face. Jordan leaned in through the open window, smiling like it was just a game. "Just sit, okay?" he said. I laughed at first, thinking he was joking, but he didn't laugh back. He nodded toward the store. "Just keep an eye out. If anyone comes, call my phone." I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I just watched him and the others walk toward the glass doors and disappear inside. The automatic door opened with a whoosh, and then they were gone. The air in the car felt too still after they left. I turned the radio down until it clicked off completely. The parking lot was empty except for one other car by the pumps. An older man in a blue jacket was filling up his tank, humming to himself. A woman with a toddler came out of the store holding a small bag of chips and a soda, got into the car, and they drove away. Everything felt normal, but something inside me twisted, a tightness in my throat. I watched the store windows. I couldn't see much, just shelves of candy, a row of refrigerated drinks, and the counter with a plexiglass divider. No sign of Jordan or the others. I looked at my phone. No messages, no calls. Just the reflection of my own face in the screen, pale and uncertain. 2 minutes passed, maybe 3. Then everything shifted. It started with a flash, just a burst of light behind the counter. Then a muffled shout, something slamming. I leaned forward, pressing my hands against the steering wheel, my heart hammering so loudly I couldn't hear anything else. Then silence. The front door swung open and Jordan came running. His face was different. Not scared, not panicked, just hard. Lacey followed, clutching something in her arms, and the guy in the hoodie brought up the rear, looking over his shoulder. They piled into the car without looking at me. "Go," Jordan barked. I blinked. "What?" "Drive," he shouted, but he was already in the driver's seat, shoving me toward the passenger side as he slid behind the wheel. My back hit the door as he threw the car into reverse. Tires squealed against the pavement as we tore out of the parking lot. No one spoke. The silence was thick, suffocating. I stared at my hands, now clenched in my lap, trembling. The streetlights blurred past us as we sped down unfamiliar roads. I didn't ask what happened. I didn't want to know. I knew anyway. Later that night, the news told the rest of the story. Gas station robbery. 1 fatality. The clerk had been shot. The police were searching for 3 suspects and an unknown driver. Security cameras had captured the car. Had captured me, sitting in the front seat, watching. They came for me 2 days later. The knock at the door wasn't angry. It was patient. When I opened it, two officers stood there, hands calmly resting near their belts, not yet reaching. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I just stood there as they read me my rights, as though I were hearing someone else's story. I remember one of them asked me if I knew why they were there. I said yes. They took my phone, my backpack, my future. Sitting in the back of the squad car, I stared out at the same world I had driven through with Jordan, only now it looked different, grayer, farther away. The interrogation room smelled like sweat and old coffee. The light buzzed overhead, and the table between us was scratched with initials and cigarette burns. They showed me the footage, asked me to explain. I told them I didn't go inside, that I didn't know what would happen, that I was just sitting there. But they didn't care. In their eyes, I wasn't a bystander. I was a lookout, a participant, an accomplice to murder. In the days that followed, I learned how much weight those words could carry. I learned that intent didn't always matter, that being in the wrong place, with the wrong people, at the wrong time, could unravel everything you had ever been. I thought of that moment in the car, when he said, "Just sit, okay?" And I had. I sat, and for that, I would lose everything. The courtroom smelled of waxed wood and damp wool, a scent that clung to everything like a second skin. I had been in rooms like this before, only on field trips or through TV screens, where justice played out like a drama with breaks for commercials. But in reality, it was nothing like a show. It was a machine. It moved slowly, without expression, grinding people into something unrecognizable. The walls were lined with dark paneling, polished so carefully that they reflected the overhead lights in thin, wavering stripes. The seal of the state glared down from above the judge's bench, flanked by a flag and a clock that ticked softly, out of step with my own heartbeat. I sat at the defense table in a plain blazer borrowed from my public defender's office. It smelled faintly of someone else's perfume, sweet and powdery, a ghost of a stranger who had worn it before me. The sleeves were too long, the shoulders too wide, but it was supposed to make me look older, more respectable, less like the naive girl I still was. My hands were folded in my lap, knuckles pressed white against each other, nails digging small crescents into my palms. I tried to hold my breath steady, but it came in shallow, uneven draws, as though my body already knew what was about to happen. My lawyer sat beside me, shuffling papers, whispering names of statutes and precedents, but his words floated past like dust motes in sunlight. The prosecutor stood at the other table, tall and sure, his suit crisp, his hair neat, his voice trained to carry across a room. He spoke of me as if I were a case file, not a person. He listed dates, times, evidence, motives. He said, "the defendant," like it was a title I had been born with. He didn't mention that I had been a student. He didn't mention that I had never held a gun. He didn't mention that my entire involvement had been sitting in a car, waiting for someone I trusted. He didn't mention my brother. He didn't mention my parents. He didn't mention anything that made me human. The jury watched him with blank faces, some leaning slightly forward, some scribbling notes. Their pens scratched softly against paper, a sound so small and relentless it made my teeth ache. They looked at me only briefly, glances like flicked coins, not long enough to see my shaking hands or the tremor in my throat. To them, I was already defined. A headline, a crime, a cautionary tale. When my lawyer spoke, his voice was lower, steadier, but it lacked the sharpness of the prosecutor's. He spoke of my age, my academic record, my lack of a criminal past. He said the words coerced and naive. He tried to explain how someone like me could be swept into someone else's crime. He tried to explain that I hadn't known what would happen, that I hadn't wanted it to happen, that I was guilty of being foolish, not malicious. His words were soft paper against a stone wall. I lifted my eyes once, across the room, to where my parents sat. They had chosen the front bench, close enough to see me, but far enough that I couldn't reach them. My father sat stiffly, his hands clasped between his knees, his eyes fixed on the floor. His face was pale, his jaw tight, as if he had turned into one of the marble busts lining the courthouse hall. My mother sat beside him, smaller somehow than she had ever seemed. Her hair, once a soft brown, was streaked with gray I hadn't noticed before. She wore her Sunday coat even though it was warm in the room, as if wrapping herself in something familiar could protect her. She met my eyes only once. For a moment, I saw everything she was holding back. The tremor at the corner of her mouth, the way her fingers twisted the strap of her purse until her knuckles blanched, the wet shine that didn't quite fall from her lashes. She looked at me as though trying to memorize my face before it disappeared. And in that look was a question I could never answer. How did we end up here? The judge entered, and everyone rose. The sound of the bailiff's voice was loud and final, echoing against the wood. When we sat again, the judge adjusted his glasses, glanced at the papers before him, and began to speak. His voice was calm, practiced, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. He spoke of trust violated, of choices made, of consequences. He said the words, accomplice to felony murder. He said public safety. He said sentence. I barely heard the number at first. It hung in the air like a bell that keeps ringing long after it's been struck. Life, not months, not years. Life. The word echoed in my head until it lost its meaning, became only sound. The courtroom did not erupt. There was no gasp, no shout, no chaos. Just the same clock ticking softly, the same flag hanging still, the same papers shuffling. But across the room, my mother moved. She lifted her hands to her face and pressed her fingers against her mouth. Her shoulders folded inward, as though the air had been punched from her lungs. She didn't cry out. She didn't fall. She simply held herself, eyes closed, as if by closing them she could unsee what had just happened. I wanted to go to her, to crawl across the floor, to bury my face in her lap the way I had as a child when nightmares woke me. But I couldn't move. The bailiff was already at my side, his hand a light but unyielding weight on my arm. The chains at my wrists were not visible to the court, but I felt them anyway. They led me toward the door at the side of the courtroom. I turned my head once, just once, to look back. My father's hand was on my mother's shoulder now, but his eyes were still fixed on the floor. My mother's face was pale, her lips moving soundlessly. She might have been praying. She might have been cursing. I will never know. The door closed behind me, heavy and final. The hallway smelled of cold air and cleaning chemicals. My footsteps echoed as we walked, each one carrying me farther from the girl I had been. I thought of my mother's face, not as an image, but as a weight pressing down on my chest. It would stay with me long after the walls of the prison swallowed me. It would be the first thing I would see in the dark when I closed my eyes. It would be the sentence beyond the sentence. I had not just lost my freedom. I had shattered something inside the person who had given me life, and no number of years would ever undo that. I had always thought prison would feel like a separate world, cold, sterile, detached from everything I had ever known. And in some ways, it did. But what I hadn't expected was how quickly the place would start to reflect back parts of myself I had never wanted to see. It wasn't the cages or the cement or the rust-colored uniforms that cut deepest. It was the mirror I found in the faces around me. The first week, I barely spoke. My voice felt alien in that place, too soft, too educated, too polite. The others didn't care what college I had gone to or how high my GPA had been. In here, my identity was stripped down to a last name and a number. My bunk was by the far wall, under a flickering fluorescent light that never quite turned off. At night, that hum became a kind of rhythm, like a synthetic heartbeat that refused to let me forget where I was. We were locked into a schedule so tight it could choke you. Wake up before the sun. Line up for a breakfast that always smelled vaguely of bleach and burned toast. Count after count after count. Every movement supervised, every gesture watched. But within those rigid lines, something more fluid took shape. A society with its own rules, hierarchies, and silent codes. I saw women who talked to the walls, not out of madness, but because the silence was more unbearable than their own voices. I saw women who slept with their shoes on, afraid that something would happen in the night. I saw women who braided each other's hair with care that bordered on reverence, as if touch were the last form of mercy left. And slowly I understood something awful and unspoken. We weren't just being punished for what we'd done. We were being made into reminders of each other's failures. I met Carla during my second week. She was tall and thin, her body all angles, her eyes hollowed out in a way that made her look permanently unfinished. She had been in and out of the system since she was 16, and she carried herself like someone who knew the rules of gravity had changed. She didn't ask me why I was there. No one ever asked directly. You learned each other's stories in fragments, in the way someone held their tray in the lunch line, in the way they flinched when a door slammed, in the way they looked at photos taped inside lockers that were falling apart. Carla once told me that prison didn't make you worse. It made you visible. It turned your guilt, your shame, your desperation into something you had to wear every day, like a second uniform. She said that the worst thing was when you realized how much of it was already inside you before you got here. And she was right. I began to see it day after day. In the mirror above the sink, cracked down the middle, I saw my own face hardening. The softness in my eyes began to dull. My mouth, once quick to smile, now pressed into a flat line more often than not. I began to memorize the sounds of the place, the slamming of gates, the bark of guards, the laughter that always held a blade. I began to carry myself differently, walk with my arms tucked in tighter, speak less, observe more. There was a woman named Patrice, older than most, who spent her days folding paper into tiny birds. She had been a nurse before she was convicted, and though she never talked about what brought her here, her hands still moved with the precision of someone who used to heal. One afternoon, she handed me one of her birds. It was made from the back of a commissary form, delicate and perfect. When I took it, her eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw myself reflected back, not as I was, but as I might have been, had I made a different choice. In that moment, I understood that prison didn't erase who we had been. It magnified it. Some women became sharper, crueler, digging into their pain like claws. Others turned soft, almost invisible, as if shrinking might help them disappear. And some, like Patrice, found a way to carve beauty from scraps, even when the world offered none. Every week I was assigned to laundry duty. The heat from the industrial machines was suffocating, and the air always smelled of damp cotton and old detergent. But folding other people's clothes became a kind of ritual. The faded names on shirts, the frayed cuffs, the tiny initials stitched by hand, each item told a story. And in folding them, I began to piece together something about survival, about how women here carried their grief in small, careful ways. A picture hidden in a sock, a comb with missing teeth, a Bible with a worn ribbon. These were not things, they were anchors. And then there were the walls, the graffiti, the scratched names, the tally marks carved into concrete. I found myself staring at one in particular, just a name and a date, etched low near the floor. I don't know who wrote it or what it meant, but I traced it with my fingers each time I passed. It became a kind of prayer, though I didn't know what I was praying for. Forgiveness, maybe, or just the chance to be seen again as more than my worst decision. Time in prison was strange. It didn't pass. It settled, like dust on a shelf no one ever cleaned. Some days blurred into each other like watercolors, others cut like broken glass. But the worst were the birthdays. Not my own, but the ones I overheard. The quiet whispers, the handmade cards passed under doors, the sudden weeping at night that someone tried to hide behind a cough. I kept track of them, silently, as if remembering gave them weight, as if it helped someone, somewhere. Eventually, I began to write. Not letters, there was no one left to write to, but sentences, fragments, questions. I wrote them on napkins, on the backs of receipts, on anything I could find. I didn't know if I was writing for myself or for some future version of me who might understand. One question returned again and again: who am I now? And the answer changed. At first, I thought I was just a victim of love, a girl who had made one terrible mistake. But the mirror of prison taught me otherwise. I wasn't just the crime, but I wasn't innocent either. I was someone who had chosen to look away at the exact moment when looking mattered most. I didn't find redemption in that place. I didn't find peace, but I found pieces of myself scattered in the women around me. I found strength in their silence, their laughter, their sorrow. And in that reflection, I began, slowly, painfully, to take ownership not just of what I had done, but of what I still could become. It didn't come all at once. There was no blinding moment of truth, no thunderclap of guilt or sudden epiphany. My remorse seeped in slowly, like rain through the cracks of an old roof, gentle at first, almost invisible, then steady, then impossible to ignore. It wasn't loud. It didn't scream. It whispered. It sat with me in the cold mornings, followed me through the routine, curled beside me at night like a dog too loyal to leave. I had stopped counting days. The calendar on the wall had long since turned meaningless. Instead, I counted things I had lost: a sunrise over coffee, the feel of pages turning in a new book, my mother's perfume, my sister's laughter, the sound of a door opening with no one to check who it was, the simple luxury of choice. They say time dulls everything, but some memories grew sharper. His smile, the boy I once tried so hard to impress, flickered behind my eyelids whenever I let my mind wander. Not the smile he gave the world, but the one he gave me when I quoted poetry or corrected him on some trivial fact. The amused smirk, the charm I mistook for love. I replayed those moments like scenes in a film I never asked to star in, and in each one, I was just a little more blind, a little more eager, a little more desperate to belong. My remorse wasn't for the sentence I served. It was for the version of myself I abandoned the moment I let someone else's values define mine. I had been raised on caution and logic, on the belief that choices had consequences, but that belief cracked the moment he touched my hand and made me feel seen. I had always thought I was smart enough to avoid falling into traps. I didn't realize that sometimes the trap is lined with everything you've ever wanted to hear. I watched the other women in the unit with different eyes as the months wore on. I saw in them a quiet strength I hadn't noticed before, not resilience in the heroic sense, but a quieter kind, the kind that knows the world owes you nothing, yet chooses to keep going. There was a woman named Rosa who had been inside for more than 15 years. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her voice held the calm certainty of someone who had made peace with the unfixable. I started sitting near her in the yard, not to talk, but just to feel less alone in the quiet. I stopped writing after a while. The words began to feel too polished, too curated. What I felt couldn't be shaped into neat paragraphs. It came in waves: shame, regret, tenderness, anger, and somewhere beneath all of it, a longing to be useful again. Not forgiven, not redeemed, just not forgotten. There was a library inside the prison, small and dusty, but filled with donated books. I started volunteering there. At first, it was just an excuse to escape the noise of the common area. But over time, I found something soothing in alphabetizing, in reshelving, in helping others find something they could disappear into. The books didn't care what I had done. They didn't flinch when I touched them. They offered new worlds without demanding I explain how I'd ruined mine. One afternoon, I found a note tucked into a battered copy of Jane Eyre. It wasn't signed. It simply read, "You still have a mind. Use it. They can't take that." I carried that scrap of paper in my pocket for weeks, as if it were a compass. It reminded me that my past didn't erase my capacity to learn, to think, to grow. I started studying again, not for a degree, not for a certificate, but because the act itself felt like stitching something back together inside me. I found an old legal dictionary on the bottom shelf, its spine barely holding. I read it cover to cover, not because I wanted to appeal my case, but because I needed to understand the language that had sealed my fate. Words like accomplice, intent, negligence held a different weight now. They weren't abstract anymore. They were personal, and in reading them, I began to accept that ignorance, even if born of naivety, was no defense against damage. Regret changed me physically. I carried myself differently. My back curved more. My eyes searched less. I walked slower. I listened more. And when I laughed, which was rare, it came out quieter, as if even joy needed to apologize for showing up here. There was one night that still visits me in dreams. It had rained, and the smell of wet concrete filled the air. I lay awake on my cot, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time, I imagined my victim's family, not in the courtroom, not on the news, but in their kitchen, sitting in silence after the phone call. A mother trying to breathe, a father closing all the windows so no one could hear the crying. That image broke something in me, not because I had never thought about them before, but because I had never let myself feel them. I wrote their names down the next day, though I had never known them, just made-up names. I wrote a letter I never sent. I didn't say sorry. Sorry felt too small. I just wrote what I would have wanted to hear if the world had taken someone from me for no reason at all. I folded the paper, placed it between the pages of my legal dictionary, and never touched it again. I didn't seek forgiveness. That word still felt like a luxury. What I sought was stillness, the ability to sit with myself and not flinch, the ability to remember who I had been, not with pride or nostalgia, but with honesty. I cleaned my cell obsessively. It was the only space I had control over. Every morning, I wiped down the sink, made the bed so tight the sheets looked military. It didn't matter to anyone but me. It was my ritual, my way of saying, I may be broken, but I am not careless. Quiet remorse didn't look like weeping or falling to my knees. It looked like reading aloud to a new inmate who couldn't sleep. It looked like choosing not to gossip. It looked like planting seeds in the garden and remembering to water someone else's patch too. It looked like resisting the urge to vanish inside my own sorrow. There was no audience for these small acts, no judge, no jury, just me. But maybe that was the point. Remorse that requires recognition isn't real. Real remorse lives in what you do when no one's watching. And in a place where every move was monitored, that meant finding freedom in the smallest corners. I once read that the human heart repairs itself after damage, cell by cell, beat by beat. I didn't know if mine ever would, but I knew that I owed it to the girl I once was, not to erase my past, but to carry it gently, not as a curse, not as a punishment, but as a reminder of how easily we lose ourselves and how quietly we begin to return.